Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to a belated welcome to our online class in social inequalities. As you might guess, I'm Dr. Spivey, and I've been talking about providing you with these sort of video lecturettes on some very important concepts. I wish I would have had this technology ready to go at the beginning of the semester, but oh well, at least we've got it now for the rest of our time together. So I hope you'll find this to be somewhat helpful, at least personalizing some of the information you're reading in the book to give you some reflections from your professor that I think it's much more efficient than sitting and trying to write some long treatise on explanations on the discussion board. Um, so what I'd like to first of all, I'd like to say in terms of your reading, first of all, let me say that the outcome for the first exam was very good. I was very happy overall. Right, overall, I was I was happy with the outcome of your first exam, and so I can see that you guys have been most of you have been studying right along and understanding for the most part what's going on with these concepts. If it's any comfort to you, I actually had this very same textbook in a class in Michigan when I was an undergrad. Of course, that was the first edition. There were some several seventh edition now. But if it's any comforting, I had some of this very similar, same few of the same questions actually that you've had on your exam. So I've been there and done that, if you will. Uh, but this is a very insightful text, and I think it really it has a central theory to it. I don't know if you've been picking up on this thread from chapter to chapter, but Healy, what he's doing in these first 5 chapters is building a theoretical model, and so each chapter builds a little bit a building block on his theoretical scaffold, if you will, in presenting a theoretical model. Then the second half of the textbook is applying his theoretical framework, looking at, for example, distinguishing between social class and gender issues, but also looking at, importantly, one that he really is central to his analysis is the difference between immigrant status and racial status, or ethnic immigrant status, voluntary minorities, and racialized minorities, forced minorities, and decoupling their historical experiences, because many times maybe the better off situations for some of the European immigrant groups is used to batter the forced minorities, racialized minorities, and so it can be used in a biased, sort of a discriminatory and prejudicial way. So he's very interested in that we are able to see the difference in the historical experience between the two, even though he stresses that we're really all ethnic groups. We all come from ethnic groups. That race, as we've seen in video, is biologically a myth. But because of historical processes, race has played a major role in the social organization of Western societies. Another thing that I think you should be attuned to as we go through from chapter to chapter and looking at his theory, is the position he takes is known as his historical materialism. He takes a materialist standpoint, and you see this with Gerhard Linsky's hypothesis or theory that that social relations change as the economic development changes or economic base changes. So as the economy changes form, the social relations change as well. And so I think you've seen this throughout the first 4 chapters. He starts out by looking at the deeper level. For example, he makes the claim that prejudice and racism is not the cause of many of the issues we see in terms of social inequality, but is a symptom of something deeper, and that something deeper is his emphasis on the economic structure of society and the interests, the social relations, and the social inequalities that are developed around the economic changes and historical changes in society. So I just want to make sure you kind of have that perspective. And I think that will make some of the bring some of these conceptions, link them in a way that makes more sense to you if you know this. That this is what this is his main emphasis. But in chapter 4, I wanted to just spend the time we have just looking at a couple of the major concepts in this chapter. I'm not going to cover everything, but I think these two are the heart of chapter 4. And that is the Noel hypothesis and the Bronner hypothesis. And it really gets at, especially looking at the 3 major minority groups in the United States, the establishment of their minority status. These theories really are very helpful. For example, in terms of the development of slavery for African Americans, it tries to answer some questions about, first of all, what would have made more common sense since Native Americans were here. Their need to transport people. Why were Native Americans? Why didn't they end up in slavery instead? And I think that the Noel hypothesis helps us to answer that question as you read in the text. So let me use my. I've just been prescribed glasses. These are not them. These are just old reading glasses. But in a couple of weeks, I'll have my. I've waited as long in life as I could before having to, but I have to have them now. So, but anyway, the Noel hypothesis states that if 2 or more groups come together in a contact situation characterized by 1, ethnocentrism, 2, competition, and 3, a differential in power, then some form of racial or ethnic stratification will result. If the contact situation has all 3 characteristics, some dominant minority group structure will be created. So he says that you basically have to have all 3 of these in place. Just because 2 groups come together, and even if it's characterized by conflict, doesn't necessarily mean that that the end result will be the development of a dominant minority group relationship. And so this theory is very good at getting at that, and you can analyze not only group relations in the United States, but also globally as well, using the Noel hypothesis. So of the 3, if we had to pick one of these that's probably most detrimental in terms of the development of a dominant minority group relation, it would be the 3rd one, differential in power. And this kind of makes sense. If you don't have a differential in power between the 2 groups, then you can be ethnocentric all day, right? Or you can have competition. Let's say over land, for example. Maybe the 2 groups are competing over land, like it was for Native Americans and European colonists. 2 groups can be ethnocentric, right? Ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge other groups or their cultural lifestyles by the standards of one's own culture, sort of a prejudicial view of another people's culture. That's ethnocentrism. You feel your way of life's better, you may want to even impose your way of life on that other group to change their to what we call cultural side or ethno side, to get rid of their cultural ways and try and assimilate them, as you'll see in parts of this text. And so you may have competition, you may have ethnocentrism going on, But if there's no differential in power, one can't impose one's will on the other group. Maybe both groups are equal in terms of, say, military power, for example. So when you look at looking at the various case studies, and in this chapter it looks at the development of slavery in the United States, it becomes clear that for Native Americans, first of all, in the earlier contact, there was really no push towards dominant minority relations because Native Americans played an economic role in the economy. So there was certainly ethnocentrism. Not so much competition at this time in terms of land. And as I stated, Native Americans were playing out an economic role in the global economy. So in terms of the fur trade, which was very big, and furs were very popular in Europe, Native Americans were on the productive end, producing the pelts. They knew think about it, they were on their own land. They knew the interior of the colonies much better than the colonists. Most of the colonists at the time were near the coast, near port cities, and so they were working in a partnership with some of the Native American groups, and in terms of they would hunt and capture deer skins, and then they would bring them to the port cities, and then they would then from there they would be placed on ships. So there was an economic relationship, tenuous maybe, and many times. For example, when we think about slavery among Native Americans, there was quite a bit of slavery among Native Americans, but a lot of them were actually shipped out of the United States, and so unfortunately, some of the tribal groups that were working along with the colonists, say in the fur trade, sometimes they would raid their enemies. They had their own enemies, and among Native American groups, tribes, and they would take slaves, and bring them to the ports, and they would trade them for other goods, and they would be placed on ships, and for many of them were taken to the Caribbean and other islands, and placed in slavery, working sugar cane fields, and also there was also Native American slaves among the U.S. population as well. Many times they were mistaken as being black or being African, and were placed into slavery, captured, and so there was a substantial amount. There's a lot of new research going on about the extent of Native American slavery in the United States. We know there was some Cherokee plantation owners in Oklahoma, for example, that actually had Native American slaves on their plantation, as well as African slaves. But in terms of the full extent of slavery and African slavery in the United States, it way outweighs the marginal case of Native American slavery, though it is certainly important to know to what extent Native American slavery was a reality. But nowhere near the extent of African slave population. But anyway, in these earlier colonial years, it certainly was ethnocentrism and competition, but it wasn't a very stark differential in power. Think about it. Most of your native groups were on their home territory. They already had the military weaponry, and they had military alliances with other Native American groups. They knew the land much better than the colonists did. Could have most likely easily have pushed the colonists out, taken them over if they had wanted to. But again, there was this sort of truce, and there was the economic activities around the fur trade that were going on at the time. But later on, when the European colonists began to move westward, and as they began to gain more power in numbers and in military, you know, standing army or military uh, power, and that you did begin to have some real competition then, right? As they began to move westward, there was competition over land, and so you had the beginning of the what was known as the Indian Wars. But even though there was a differential in power, it took many decades before the Native Americans were subdued, all the way up to 1890, which the incident at Wounded Knee, the massacre at Wounded Knee, is sort of symbolic of the defeat of the Native Americans and the end of the Indian Wars. And at this time, they entered into a minority group status in 1890 onward, being placed on reservations, for example. So we see here that this was not a sort of something that happened in terms of their minority group status. It didn't happen automatically. It took many decades before they were finally subdued, and differential in power was overwhelming at that point, and they were defeated militarily. And so Native Americans found themselves in a minority group status. So in terms of African Americans, the Atlantic slave trade was developing, and the plantation owners had tried various, they had tried white servants servitude, and that didn't work out. Native Americans was not that was not going to happen, and so with the onward development of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans was the when we think in terms of the Noel hypothesis, was the best choice. If you think about it again, African slaves were, first of all, even at the ports in Africa, Africans were coming from many different ethnic backgrounds, speaking many different languages. So once they were mixed, one way they were to lessen their ability to communicate was to mix all these different ethnic groups together. They weren't able to speak and communicate, so that's one way in which power was taken from you. But then being taken from home and being shipped across the horrible conditions to the Americas, and then being in a strange place, knowing no one. At that point, in terms of the differential in power, the colonists had the upper hand, and being sold into slavery. Sometimes families actually split apart. Just a very powerless situation to be in. So for African Americans, and with the advent of slavery, the minority group status was developed early on, and whereas for Native Americans, as I said, it took many decades before Native Americans became officially a minority group. So we in this situation, then once you look at it and read here about the Noel hypothesis, it makes sense then of why Africans were chosen and taken for slavery. And then it also looks at so in terms of the competition for Native Americans, the competition was over land eventually. For African Americans, the competition was sort of indirect, but it was over labor. Who was going to do this backbreaking labor on these plantations and this plantation economy? Then you have a third group that the chapter looks at, the Mexican Americans, and being in the Southwest. When you look at the Mexican American experience, it's really incorporates aspects of both Native American and the African American experience. In terms of relating to the Native American experience, it would have been over the competition for land in the Southwest. And once there was a pretty strong power differential, and there was certainly battles that went on, and I guess the Alamo is one of the more famous ones in the popular culture. But they were defeated, and so there was that differential in power that was established. Certainly ethnocentrism, competition over land. But then there was also, in terms of labor, so Mexican Americans reflect the African American experience in terms of having, once their land was taken, then they were forced to work on these farms and agricultural uh, uh, institutions in the Southwest. So you just read these three case studies utilizing the Noel hypothesis to give an explanation as to their development of their minority group status. So I think it's a very insightful model, theoretical model to utilize. And again, you could use this Noel hypothesis, as you will see later chapters. You can look at, for example, in the Middle East, between Israelis and the Palestinian conflict. There's ethnocentrism, of course, competition over land, differential in power established. So you have this. You can look all around the globe and find apartheid in South Africa, for example. You can use this same model to analyze the development of dominant minority relationships there as well, in many other places. The Blauner hypothesis states, and it's related, it extends, I think, the Noel hypothesis. But let's look here on page 153, the Blauner hypothesis. First of all, Robert Blauner was a sociologist who wrote an influential book in 1972, and the name of that book was Racial Oppression in America. And he identified two different initial relationships, and I think I said this at the introduction, that distinguishing between colonization and immigration, and looking at how that determines the historical trajectory for various minority groups in the United States. So the hypothesis goes, the Blauner hypothesis states that minority groups created by colonization will experience more intense prejudice, racism, and discrimination than those created by immigration. Furthermore, the disadvantaged status of colonized groups will persist longer and be more difficult to overcome than the disadvantaged status faced by groups created by immigration. So what he's really describing here is a concept that you've already seen, and that's involuntary and voluntary minority groups, right? But he has the term colonized. So you can think of colonized minority groups as involuntary minority groups. Immigrant minority groups, for the most part, at least partly voluntary. We don't want to draw, you don't want to draw a rosy picture about the conditions for many European immigrant groups. Think about the Irish, for example, were highly discriminated against, and lots of prejudice, in terms of housing and in terms of stereotypes, and cartoons, caricatures were as grotesque many times as they were for African Americans. In fact, many of the same imageries and all of early African Americans in slavery were utilized to characterize the Irish, for example. But one of the big differences is they didn't come over in shackles. They weren't at the point of a gun. So they came here with even if it was a minimum, they came over maybe with some resources, families intact, may have already had family members here when they arrived, so a softer landing. Over time, as they begin to lose some of their ethnic identification, some of their ethnic cultural differences, accent, other aspects of their cultural identity, they began to, and because they were racially very similar to the dominant group, they were easily to to assimilate into the dominant culture. And you went from being isolated in segregated community to being mayors and police and many other occupations that we come to take for granted today. Um, so the colonized minority groups were not they were forced, or they were for the most part involuntary minority groups. Many of them were in slave status, and assimilation was very extremely difficult, even forbidden by the dominant group. Members of the minority group are identified by highly visible racial or physical characteristics that helps to maintain and reinforce their oppressed position. So minority groups created by colonization, they will have a historical experience that's much harsher and more persistent rejection by the dominant group. And may last for a long time, such as for African Americans, which really their colonized status really lasted all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement. So you think about it, it's just a few decades ago, and especially in the South, we're at a complete disadvantage until mid to late 1960s and even onward. So get a grasp of this difference between the colonized minority group and the immigrant minority group. And again, I think this is one of Healy's subtext, if you will, in this whole book, is he's trying to decouple the historical experience between the immigrant groups and the colonized racialized minority groups. So these two hypotheses are, again, can be used for comparative historical analyses, not just groups in the United States, but groups around the globe. So they're going to be giving you examples later in further chapters where we'll look at international dominant minority relationships, and I think you'll find this theory to be very helpful. And in fact, once we get past chapter 5, we go into the historical case studies. You're going to see the Noel hypothesis and the Bloner hypothesis. Both of these will be used to make analysis in all of those rest of the chapters in the textbook, as well as, and I didn't have the opportunity to have a video for you for the first chapter, where they talked about the key concepts of prejudice, individual discrimination, institutional discrimination, and racial ideology. And so most of you did well on the test in terms of those concepts. But those 4 concepts as well are central to the text, and you'll see those come up again when we get into some of these case studies. They'll play a role in the analysis of where people have been, their historical experiences, but also in terms of social class experiences, social class status, gender. And one of another main task for him in the text is he's trying to show how various groups have varied in terms of their historical development and historical experience, so that through analyzing comparatively those historical trajectories, we can have a better understanding of where people are today, how groups differentiate in terms of where they are in terms of along many indicators, in terms of their education, their health profiles, experiences with law enforcement, you name it. These theories, these concepts helps us to get a better grasp of where people are today. And so anyway, I think that pretty much covers that chapter. Very important to get a grasp of the Noel hypothesis and the Bloner hypothesis. And so I'll be seeing you on the discussion board, and I look forward to our next chapter, and we'll have another lecturette for every chapter from now until the end of the semester. So see you later. Okay, have a good weekend.